I'm really thrilled to be here. I've learned so much over the last couple of days, and I'm not even a social scientist. I'm a humanist. I work at the intersection of social science and the humanities, but it's been a great lesson for me to be here, and I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you today about, and actually I think the whole session will provide us with a moment of self-reflection, because we're going to be talking about the very milieus in which we do our research. The very contexts that make that research possible, and the kinds of sets of parameters and limitations and constraints that we all run up against. So I think it's a good place to end off the day and the conference. So I'm a media studies scholar, actually, and one of the things that I study are new forms of labor and reputation seeking and self-making in the wake of digital media. I also write about the history of the university as a political and cultural site. And I'm also a somewhat reluctant academic labor activist, having been the president of my faculty association. I am not, and I want to make this clear, a bibliometrician. I'm not involved in impact assessment in any really intense way. I'm not into in scientometrics or whatever. But I am someone who's really interested in looking at a kind of macro level at the context within which we do our work as scholars and as researchers, and to think about who gets to define these terms: innovation, impact, relevance, under what conditions and for what reasons. And so today, what I actually want to do, and this is just to come, is to look at some contextual elements focusing specifically on the university as a kind of privileged site for the generation of research. I know some of you work in institutes and in different contexts, but mostly I'm going to look at the state of the current university. Then I want to do just a really brief overview of research metrics, because as I said, I'm not really concerned with the specificity of the metrics. I'm concerned with how they're being deployed and in what way. And we're seeing them now be privatized, and I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to look at them as a form of performance management, so how universities are using these metrics to manage performance in their workforce. And I'm going to look at some of the contradictions that they engender, and then I want to end up in a more hopeful place, looking at some of the alternatives that have come from the research community itself to speak back against some of these privatized measures that I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so I have quotation marks around neoliberal, knowing very well that it is a completely overused term. I had a whole section of the talk that I cut out talking about neoliberalism and its discontents. But for the most part, I want to jump right to the university. So in what is now a very familiar story, we've seen over the last several decades, notions of the public good become more and more narrowly defined in terms of what is good for the market. As scholar Jeffrey Williams writes, the public good is increasingly construed as being served by the corporate world as they beneficently give us jobs and consumable goods. So those intangibles, those values that cannot be subject to the logic of the market, that are difficult to measure or quantify, or that do not serve instrumental immediate ends, such as, for example, environmental stewardship, social justice issues, diversity, those things tend to get pushed out of discourse. Or even, as I will venture to guess, our own integrity as a research profession. So that's what happens. These neoliberal ideas have given rise to what Sheila Slaughter and Gary Rhodes have called academic capitalism. And this is I highly recommend checking this book out, because it is the most trenchant critique of the structural transformations we've seen on university campuses over the last 30 years. So in which universities are firmly and cozily situated at the margins in between the state and the market. Enthusiastic participants in the blurring of the boundaries between the private and the public, and increasingly involved, as they are forced to become corporations themselves, in the circulation and investment of finance capital, either through endowment funds, through construction, through real estate. Universities are being forced to generate more and more diverse revenue streams, so that the core mission of the university, which is teaching and research, kind of fades from view a little bit. So here are some of the structural transformations in universities that we've seen over the last several decades, but definitely have intensified since 2008. And under the aegis of austerity. And this is a term that gets deployed in a lot of different ways. But within the university, we've seen a whole bunch of different ways, different sets of effects. First, as public funding dries up, we see rising tuition fees and rising amounts of student debt, which work as a barrier to access for students. And universities come to see students more as commodities and customers to be served. We're all their service providers. You've all heard this language. We see internally the pressure on researchers to deliver research with commoditizable results. We've seen increasing amounts of corporately sponsored research. And when I say these things, I'm not throwing them all out. I'm saying we're seeing an intensification of these things. And each one of these changes we could talk about for a very long time, and there are pluses and minuses to them. We've seen, for example, the growing use of contract faculty, badly paid, precariously employed contract faculty. We've seen the growing use or attempt to use MOOCs and various other forms of technology to cut labor costs, in other words, to sort of not hire as many people. We've seen growing marketing and branding, money spent on marketing and branding. We're all real estate speculation, the courting of high fee-paying international students, and the opening of branch plant campuses around the globe, which often challenge ideas of academic freedom. So, and for what I'm going to talk about today, we've seen the growth of a deep audit culture with performance management software at its center. But I could also name administrative bloat. I could say the erosion of collegial self-governance. There's all kinds of ways in which we've seen the university transform. The entrenchment of an audit culture specifically, and the perpetual evaluation of teaching and research and measurement of our inputs and outputs is one of the most significant aspects of these structural changes. They're symptomatic of what Ulrich Beck has called the political economy of risk, in which a presumed crisis of trust in public institutions leads to this inevitable deficit slashing and replacement of tried and true systems of self-regulation. I mean, the word university, universitas, simply means self-governance. That's where it comes from. We get this all replaced with stricter regimes of externally imposed audit and control. So as Chris Shore writes, audit culture refers to a general climate in which techniques of accountancy become a central organizing principle in the governance and management of human conduct. So what we get is accountability conflated with accounting, right? So here, being accountable to the public is recast in terms of measures of productivity, economic efficiency, and delivering value for money. So it's all about the bottom line. And this often happens in the form of performance management strategies. In higher ed, these can include target definitions, benchmarking, strategic plans, comparative league tables, and perpetual performance appraisals via performance management systems like research metrics, privatized research metrics, which I'm going to talk about soon. But as Massimo De Angelis and David Harvey argue, inevitably administrators will act through the metrics, right, to shape workplaces, sensibilities, and behaviors. So the metrics aren't benign. They have a set of effects, and I think we should all be aware of them. Now, as I've said, I am no student of bibliometrics. I don't know the difference between, I had to write it down, archival resource keys and digital object identifiers. This is not me, but maybe the computer scientists in the room could help me out. But I do want to acknowledge, first and foremost, that bibliometrics and scientometrics and those people who work in those fields have played a central role in the generation and circulation of knowledge. And I don't want to diss them in this discussion. I'm not, as I said, so I want to acknowledge their hard work. But I want to look at the ways in which their work has been privatized and packaged and deployed. So I'm not questioning the reliability, the objectivity, the comprehensiveness, or any of these metrics. I'm looking rather at their representational and disciplinary power as they're employed within the neoliberal university. So research metrics these days are marked by a central distinction, primarily between traditional citation metrics like Scopus, Web of Science, PubMed, or Crossref, and what's called alt metrics, which you guys are probably familiar with, which are forms of metrics that are claiming to be able to measure the impact of our work across digital media. So they're looking at bookmarking and tweeting and likes and things like academia, edu, et cetera. And then, of course, here's the list of the most common sets of citation metrics and metrics that we are all very familiar with: the journal impact factor, the H index, the G index, and the I-10. So these are just basically definitions, but as I said, I want to skip right over them to get to the juice of what I have to say, which is that many of these metric systems are privately owned, and they are black boxed. So it's very difficult to get at how they're being used, how they're, what algorithms are actually being used. And I think it's really crucial for us to know that places like Elsevier and Thomson Reuters owns Web of Science, Reed Elsevier owns Scopus. They are not just academic publishers. These are major multinational corporations who provide, quote unquote, information solutions to professional customers across many different types of businesses. So they service, say, the tax and accounting industry, the legal and governance industries, life sciences, big pharma, all of this. Elsevier netted $900 million last year. Thomson Reuters net close to $2 billion. Both of these companies grew by at least 3% year over year, which was a pretty good growth rate. And from the corporate research that I was able to do, that growth was driven in large part by the development of what both Elsevier and Thomson Reuters call their research intelligence products. So these are comprehensive packages of software that combine their research metrics services into larger comprehensive research and performance management tools to sell, or basically to license, to universities. So Thomson Reuters package software claims that it's going to help customers, aka administrators, understand the research activities at their organization, enabling programs to attract top researchers, secure funding, facilitate collaborations, benchmark with peers, and allocate resources to advance their mission and scholarship. Okay, so on the surface, that doesn't seem too pernicious. Elsevier's SciVal claims to offer a comprehensive portfolio of research management solutions, these are quotes from their website, designed to provide a sharp panoramic view of your institution's research activities. Through the SciVal suite of services, we combine institutional and external information with data from Scopus to help institutions drive successful research outcomes. By providing easily readable research metrics, Insights in SciVal claim to serve a range of purposes. So here's some purloined slides that a colleague gave me from a pitch that Thomson Reuters made to a university. So I put a few up here from there. This would be on their pitch to license their software. But basically, this is how they pitch it to universities in terms of the outcomes universities can look to if they implement these privatized software packages. They claim to serve a range of purposes, as you can see, including bolstering strategic plans, improving university rankings, propping up PR and marketing, and most importantly, streamlining and standardizing annual faculty performance reviews and promotion and tenure processes. So in a very frightening story out of the University of Manitoba, an overzealous administrator in the Department of Nursing decided that she was going to use the external recommendations of Insights for where the tenure bar should be for all nurses. And the problem with this software, of course, is that it doesn't look at contextual factors, resource factors at all. It doesn't have a notion of comparator. It just gives you everything you need to know. So they tried to implement this tenure bar, and of course, people were freaking out who were coming up for tenure. Eventually, they were forced to back down by the Faculty Association because they had it in their collective agreement, which is why it's good to be unionized. But what you can see by this are two things. First, you can see why overburdened administrators would be in love with the software, because it's going to save them a lot of time and dealing with peer review and local culture, right? But you can see also how terrifying it would be for young scholars who are coming up for promotion or looking for publication, whatever it might be, or looking for grant funding, to have to be compared without context, without any kind of understanding of context, to all their peers everywhere that Insights is being used. So, and certainly we can think about institutions who are going through austerity measures. In Ontario, for example, Nova Scotia, that in these contexts, this kind of easily imposed research metrics work really effectively to conflate measuring with targeting. disciplining scholars who, by strongly suggesting they pursue certain kinds of research, but also by limiting them, by targeting those scholars who don't seem to be as productive. Completely overwriting internal, collective, collegially determined levels. So, no doubt, university administrators will act through these metrics to cut labor and intensify workload. And of course, there's just another slide, sorry. The most compelling reason for universities to use these packaged, privatized software is to support the university standing in what is probably the most insidious and potentially destructive of all the metrics out there, which is the university rankings, right? The overall university rankings, the most influential of these are the QS ranking, the Times Higher Ed ranking, US News and World Report, or here in Canada, Maclean's. All of these rankings are relatively new. They've only really been around since the 2000s, but man, the power that they have now over universities is quite remarkable. And much, much ink has been spilled on the problems with these university rankings. I don't have time to get into it, but maybe we can talk about it in the discussion section. But what we can say is that what they've done is they've effected a kind of wholesale change in university autonomy. And we have a kind of tail wagging the dog situation where everyone's chasing the rankings, and the criteria for what constitutes a university, its core mission, is being set by external agents who are not accountable in any way. It also works to redistribute resources so that certain money flows to those areas that are going to be seen to be bolstering the rankings. A very egregious example of this happened in the US recently. You may have read about it at Mount St. Mary's University, where the president there told his faculty members that they should identify first-year students in the first month that they were there who would be likely to drop out and get them to drop out. He used some very unfortunate language. He basically said, you have to drown the bunnies, hold a Glock to their heads. He was eventually forced to resign. It's a Catholic university. But the fact is, why he was telling them to do that was because retention is a major feature in the US News and World Report rankings, and he thought that if he could get rid of this, and they only start counting retention a month after people start the program, so if he could get them to drop out earlier, then that would bolster their rankings. So this is the kind of illogic that can come from this kind of rankings mania. The deployment of these research metrics, these privately owned and controlled metrics, are not without other significant contradictory effects. One set of reactions on the part of the professoriate in relation to the imposition of these metrics is what the authors of a recent editorial in the journal Research Policy called coercive citation, or research citation fraud, essentially. And there are several websites online that will actually offer to like your paper, bookmark your paper, tweet about your paper, and circulate your paper to amp up your alt metrics. So my position is, whenever you impose a situation like this, you're asking for it to be gamed. And it's definitely being gamed. So there are a bunch of micro workers out there liking people's articles over and over again. But the most common tendencies to stretch the boundaries of academic honesty in order to amp up citation counts are this research coercive citation. So that can involve self-plagiarism, which means that you cite the findings and contents of a previous paper that you've written without attribution, intimating that the findings are original. Or salami publishing, which was their phrase, not mine, but it's a great phrase, where you cut up your research project into a bunch of tiny bits and then you send it out to a bunch of different places to be published. Or redundant publication, where you just actually lie and send the same article out to a million different places to be published. According to Research Policy's meta review, the number of articles resorting to these types of activity has risen nearly five-fold, from 170 in 2000 to 820 in 2012. And the number of retractions that journals have had to issue has increased more than tenfold in a single decade, from around 30 a year in the early 2000s to some 400 in 2011. There have also been reports of journals engaging in similar kinds of dubious activities to try to amp up their journal impact factor by asking young scholars who want to publish with them to cite from articles that journal has previously published, right, in order to get published. So it's a kind of, blackmail, if you want. And of course, young scholars who are eager to be published often have to acquiesce. So installed within the competitive logics of academic capitalism then, we can't afford to see research metrics as simply neutral descriptors of the world of research. Instead, as Espeland and Sauter argue, they function as vehicles for inducing changes in performance, creating a form of reactivity that causes people to change their behavior in desired ways. So as scholars work to secure their jobs, their funding, and their reputations, and as citation metrics tend only to reward work that reconfirms current fads and fashions, scholars are tacitly discouraged from taking the path less traveled in their work, from trying out new or unpopular ideas or areas of research, from engaging in pure curiosity-driven research, from taking the risk of critique or risking being wrong. Right? So it threatens the very nature of our research integrity. So in effect, and ironically, the now hyper-competitive habitus of academic research, fueled by research metrics, undercuts the very innovation and out-of-the-box thinking that governments are demanding from academics these days. The effects of metrics in practice undermine the very reasons cited for their existence in the first place. As anthropologist Marilyn Strathern notes, the contradictory logic is embedded within the concept of accountability itself. Accountability implies that people want to know how to trust one another and to make their trust visible. But the very desire to do so points to the absence of trust. So the distrust and desire for control that are patently on display in the imposition of research metrics, these metrics in turn undermine the implicit trust, the academic freedom, the concomitant sense of responsibility and community and reciprocity that an expert system like the university needs to operate optimally. So this is a deep paradox of the university. It's been there forever, but we can talk about it more. The more metrics are imposed in these privatized ways, thinly disguised as performance management, the less scholars feel any responsibility at all to knowledge, to their colleagues, their students, and their communities. Okay, so now I want to look at some of the alternatives that have risen, just as I finish up here, from the rank and file, as we like to see, from scientists themselves, to speak out against these kinds of privatized measures. So probably the most famous is the Leiden Manifesto, or Leiden Manifesto. You can probably, is it Leiden? Okay, which was published in Nature in 2015. So here they write about the need for researcher-generated best practices so that researchers can hold evaluators to account, and evaluators can hold their indicators to account. So here is, like, we need to audit the auditors because we are the professionals and we need to assert that. We know best about our research. We know how to measure it. Peer review is, deeply imperfect, but it's better than this kind of externalized, standardized form of measure. So here are just a few of the things that they suggest: that the choice and use of indicators should take into account the wider socioeconomic and cultural contexts, that we should account for variation by field, and this is huge for the arts and humanities versus STEM, that we should recognize the systemic effects of assessment and indicators, so some of those I just talked about. Another one is from the American Society for Cell Biology that was published in 2012, the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which calls for the elimination of journal-based metrics altogether, and especially in relation to funding, appointment, and promotion, to assess research on its own merits, to have transparency in terms of the data and methods used to calculate all metrics, and to make assessments based on scientific content rather than publication metrics. So, as we've seen, these metrics serve a disciplinary function, undermining academic planning and collegiality, intensifying workload, reconstituting academic researchers as atomized, competitive, entrepreneurial selves seeking self-advantage and reputational capital, and directing research activities away from basic curiosity-driven research. But the current deployment of these metrics packaged as forms of research intelligence produce contradictions that cannot be sustained. This would be my argument. And at this time of deep uncertainty about what researchers and what universities mean and signify in the world at large, it's time for us to engage in what Massimo D'Angelis and David Harvey have called the struggle over measure. It's time for us to pay attention to the ways that these metrics are being imposed, and because I would argue that no less than our academic integrity and the future of basic research is at stake. So thanks.
Thank you. My question is primarily directed at Alison. Very thought-provoking discussion, and something that I'll admit I've not given much thought to myself. As you were talking, I pulled up my own institution's white paper on bibliometrics just to see what we're doing. But I was struck by your etymology of university, and that we are essentially self-governing. And you portrayed it as if this is imposed solely externally, but aren't we just as culpable? I would challenge any scholar in this room to say they've never self-Googled their H-index, or don't we also drive that?
So, yeah, it's a really great question. And really there was so much of this argument that got left on the cutting room floor. And in terms of my own research into the history of the university, when I talked about the university, the word universitas really means a group that governs itself. It doesn't mean a universality of knowledge, and most people think it means that. That's not what it means. That's not where it comes from. But the university's always been a deeply paradoxical institution, as I sort of intimated. So, always needing authorization from outside agents, whether it was the church or the king or, the state, but also needing separation from those outside agents in order to reflect upon, criticize, intervene. And so there's this fundamental paradox. But in terms of the sort of us being involved in it, I think it's, I think those of us who've been around maybe longer than you have seen these structural transformations and lived them and experienced them in a really visceral way. So that the idea of the sort of entrepreneurial professor is actually relatively new as an idea. The entrepreneurial reputation-seeking, metric-seeking, and all of us, I totally understand. I write about metrics in different contexts. So I look at social scoring online, for example, and things like cloud, and the ways that those also have a kind of glamour. So I have a piece called The Glamour of the Analytic. So there's something magical about numbers, that even people who don't really understand numbers want to be scored. And we can have a big conversation about that. But I think in terms of that habitus, I think that's partially, well, it's a product of these structural transformations. So the way that we think about ourselves as scholars, the ways that we think about our communities and our subjectivity as scholars have really undergone massive changes, like I tried to point out in the last 30 years. And in terms of being all of us implicated, yes, I would say absolutely. And I would encourage us to think about not just ourselves, though, in terms of everybody here is a successful scholar. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. But, but I would argue that there's something about collegiality. There's something about thinking of ourselves in community that is powerful. And there's a lot of ways that we talk about it in this context of the entrepreneurial university. We talk about collaboration or interdisciplinarity or all of that stuff. And not to say that's not good, but as Keane was pointing out, there's a kind of individualizing ethos around the idea of the entrepreneur. And I would want to encourage us to think less about ourselves as sort of the isolated, atomized scholar, and rather as being part of a community of scholars who can really link together and whose fortunes are in fact tied together. So that would be my answer.
Do you have any ideas on how we could do that? Because we've heard that, bioethanol in a lot of ways doesn't make any sense because we need such big, large refineries, and yet that's where the funding is. So almost to the point of being opportunistic, right? You go after the funding and where it is, and a lot of people, and then there's a bloom of publications in this area and so on. So are there any ideas, or anyone else out here, again, how we can move away from this? As one of my colleagues put it, at the end of the day, everybody can count. So when you're on a grant panel or you're on merit review, oh, this person has 10 papers, this person has 12 papers. We'll rank them. And again, we heard some comments about taking things out of context, right? That you say, again, right? But that context is hard and it takes time. And we've heard that again over the past few days. A lot of times we don't have that time to stand back and reflect. It really doesn't make sense. And then tying in some of the other talks, right? We've heard about climate change and so on, and where the money's going, and whether developing new app, and then how much energy is it taking to collect all these statistics and do all these things, and yet we're worried about getting a better model. But how do we get a better model without putting more CO2 into the atmosphere, right? So I don't know if anyone has any bright ideas. Yeah.
Oh, I don't have any bright ideas. I just wanted to follow up with, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I don't have any bright ideas, ever. I did want to point out that I suddenly remembered, in terms of rent seeking, academics are the epitome of rent seekers. They're the epitome of rent seekers because they're extracting value, or capturing value from past investments, the past investments being our PhDs, our publications, and so on. So that's, that's very much involved in this kind of metrics, if you like. So, yeah, sorry, I don't have any solutions.
Did you want to add anything, Kevin?
Sure, yeah. I would say that, there is a way to come up with a number that we could imagine as being objective, but there are many different ways in which to interpret that number. And I think that, yeah, absolutely, it is very difficult to bring context to the H-index or to citation counts and these sorts of things, but we shouldn't refrain from doing things just because they are difficult. So I think that we need to demand that the process enables us to be evaluated in context rather than through single values and single digits. Now, we are active every day in building and rebuilding this institution that we call Academy, and in our own institutions and in our own departments. And so it will require conscious, daily, difficult effort. But I mean, to think that we could allow that our ability to repurpose and develop these institutions to be overrun by H-indexes is I think, something that we can get around.
And I just would add to that, for a bunch of really smart people, I think we tend to not look at the determinations of our own context. I mean, I think we like to think of ourselves as autonomous agents of our own destiny. And as researchers, specifically, for those of us who are like research intensive, we don't like to think about the university as being our location. We might think about, well, we're more tied to our professional association, or we're more tied to, some other kind of collaborative group that we're in. And yet universities are actually ground zero for the structuring of knowledge. And I always wonder, like, how could we think that we're somehow free from the determinations of our context? Like, how could we think that we're somehow special in that way, and that it's up to us to really, because when you think of all the things that aren't included in assessment, like community work, different kinds, like Chantal was talking about that in her talk, there's all different forms of knowledge and different forms of outreach, being a public intellectual, doing all sorts of different things that when, at the end of the day, don't come down, like don't show up when you're counting. And all of us have been on promotion and tenure committees or hiring committees, and we're just like counting. And we've all had the experience of like bringing people in for interviews, and they look great on paper, and then they get in front of you, and you're like, what is going on? So, so I think that you can never really tell, but I think it's really, that's why I think it is up to us to try to change the system and fight back, and why I put up the Leiden Manifesto and the San Francisco Declaration is because those were actually thought through efforts on the part of professional associations and groups of researchers to say, it's got to come from us. And we know how context plays in because we are the people who are doing the research. So we should be able to do it. We've tried.
Mine was more of a kind of, it'd be interesting, I think we've only heard from Canadian academics so far, it'd be interesting to see what the British perspective on this is, because I'd see the British as being far more socialized for longer by certain kinds of metrics, ref and all that sort of stuff.
Just sort of, I'll let that, please pass on the ball. But one thing I would like to sort of add in here to the discussion, because you opened up as a chair to just take advantage of it, right? As you mentioned, you're all selfish, self-centered people, so why not? I think the issue here is also, as the question here was mentioning, is outside bodies that have provided us with a hammer, I would sort of say it, and I think it is the management of the university and the administration that is using that hammer rather than sort of putting down the nail in its place, sort of putting down on the head of the faculty member. So it's an issue of the management, I would see, and how it's been used in this tool rather than anything. That can be part of also the discussion. But UK perspective, please.
Well, actually, I mean, it was exactly as you're saying, and this is something that's quite interesting to me as a relatively new academic in the UK, and it does come back to the ref. So we have this formal government applied system for assessing research in the UK, and we're specifically excluded from using things like citation metrics in assessing this, and it's entirely contextual. You're supposed to rank 4 papers for each academic on a scale from 0 to 4 star, which is related to how you see it in the international community. Now, I've been asked to internally calibrate some of our things in my own department, which means I've got to read 50 papers by next week from my colleagues. And obviously that, because it's in my field, so I have to have the context to do this. And I was kind of wondering whether, I mean, I was really interested, especially Alison, with what you were talking about in terms of us. I mean, it's a great summary of the way the administrative response, basically, to externally applied things, but the government, we have say about how the government assesses us to a greater extent. And do you think this is there a right way that we can account for academic performance? And if so, I mean, provocatively maybe, is the ref closer to being right than pure metrics?
Well, I think accountability is such a dicey term. It's a problematic thing under any circumstances. So I would say, yeah, absolutely, there are better ways to do it. And I was talking specifically about these privatized metrics, these software packages. So not necessarily about exercises like the ref, and I'm not that familiar with the ref. But I do have many colleagues in the UK who. And so this is why I'm talking about the sort of disciplinary function of the ref. So even if the way that the ref is administered feels more reasonable to you, it infiltrates the psyche, let's just say, of people in the academy. And I know people who haven't been targeted as research active. It's devastating to them. And it also has a very divisive kind of impact, as far as I can tell. Amongst the professoriate. So in terms of undermining collegiality, that's one thing I would say about it. But I do also know colleagues, I've talked to colleagues in the UK who say, oh, it's no big deal, and then other colleagues who go, it's completely overwhelming, it takes up too much time. So then comes the issue of, is it actually productive? Like, how much time is actually being spent doing this when it could be spent doing research? So, then there's the sort of more pragmatic angle to it as well, so.
So as by far the oldest British academic here, I should point out that there's certain things about, your lecture was fantastic, but I think, because I've been in the game longer, that certainly from the UK perspective, I would see it slightly differently, in the sense that the academics and the government started the assessment long before these tools appeared. And I actually think they may have created the market, which it wasn't the corporations dreamt this up and then thought, how can we sell it? They were answering a market, because the research assessment started 30 years ago, or I think the first one was in '89. And what makes them different from, I think, the way that the assessment is done in Canada is that the funding of the university is directly related to the outcome of the assessment. And so it has done all sorts of things. One is that it has created much more of a sort of football player, soccer, I'm sorry, not a player, to translate in North American language, soccer player market, that there has been a big transfer market, and it has had a very positive, or if you like, inflationary effect on academic salaries, because universities think they can buy in a superstar professor with wonderful publications, but the problem is that if then their rating doesn't go up, they don't get so much money, and they have grossly overspent. So all hell breaks loose after the assessment, because they have to recoup the money that is not coming in. And the other point is that the research assessment, to begin with, I think did have a positive effect, because certainly when I started research, there were a lot of faculty members who were not at all research active. They sat in their offices composing music or whatever. Well, I mean, not if they were a music academic, but for chemists, that is perhaps not their primary function. And so I think that what has happened is the assessment was quite productive, but it has gradually become more and more an accounting tool. And as you know, the UK is dominated by accountants. And therefore, I think, unfortunately, many of these developments are being driven by that. And for example, the impact factor was developed by university librarians to decide which journal subscriptions they could get rid of. It was not intended at all to drive people's publications. And the final thing is that I was looking at some of my old publications from the 1980s, and in those days, we did not care about the order of the authors, we did not have starred authors, and we didn't really worry all that much about the journal. We chose the journal where the editors didn't fiddle around with the English and things like that, rather than worrying about what the impact factor was and so on. Well, it didn't exist in that stage. So I think that we are to blame quite a lot for these things. But as a senior professor, there is the difficulty, if I say we should publish in this journal, which is of low impact factor, then my younger colleagues whose careers depend on this publication as well say, well, look, it won't do as much good. So we've got into a vicious circle. But I think, unfortunately, the UK is considerably to blame for the mess, which has then been exploited in totally different directions by all sorts of other countries. I'm sorry, that was rather a long speech.
Quite a bit of an illuminating Q&A. We learned that we are selfish. We learned we can conveniently, again, blame the British for our problems. Fantastic. Let's see what else we can get today.
Yeah, so just take that exactly around, I guess, is that I see that there's a problem, but on the other hand, we are part of society. We are part of taxpayers. I mean, most of us are taxpayer funded. Society is about accounting. Don't we get a really big communication problem if we say that we are very special and then that we don't need to abide by numbers and that we don't need to be externally assessed? And how are we going to explain that to the people who work in banks, who work in companies where that is the norm? Why are we different?
Well, okay, so the university's existed for 1,000 years. It's a very unique institution. It has a long and complicated history. It's never been pure. It's not a pure site. It's always been a contradictory site, as I said before. I would never argue that we don't need to be accountable, either to each other or to the outside world. I would never argue that. For me, it's the conflation of the notion of accountability with accounting, so that all it is about the bottom line, so that all it is about numbers and what, you know, and so we do need to do a better job at coming up with language. And I mean, those of us in the arts and humanities, we live it every day. It's like, well, you've got to do a better job explaining why you're relevant, right? And I'm thinking, this is what I said in my talk about being pushed out of discourse, that there are certain values that can't be expressed anymore inside the sort of logic of accountability as accounting. And I had a whole part of my talk that I cut out about neoliberalism and flexible accumulation and the sort of broader political economic context, which is, it's interesting that Martin said 1989, I mean, it started in the 1970s, this sort of push, new form of capitalist mode of production, which is, where we actually see what happened, and the ascendancy of finance capital, which we've seen, Keane talked about how that works for innovation. But really, debunking the myth that it's somehow playing back into the public good. When all you have, what was the number? 100 billion sucked out of the market?
400 billion.
Into the pockets of the financiers. And so I think that that's just one example of the sort of the cultural ethos, the sensibility that it's always just about the bottom line. We have to be accountable in terms of money, or that citizens are taxpayers. That's another illusion that we've seen happen over the last 30 years. And I know it's easier said than done to just say, well, that's wrong. Citizens are different than taxpayers, or citizens are partially taxpayers, but they're also should be involved in democratic deliberations, and they do deserve to have people in the university account for what they're doing. But I'm just arguing that the methods that we use to assert our accountability need to be more nuanced than just the counting. And they need to be contextual, and they need to recognize the specificity of resource allocation, because we know people in smaller universities who don't have access to funds, but they could be great scholars. The issues of social justice and diversity and inclusion, all of those things, we need to be tackling them. And they should be a part of the university's mission, and that's all I'm arguing. It's a bit of a different.
Yeah.
So I have a slightly facetious point and then a slightly more serious point. The facetious point was in relation to this notion of the 400 billion a year that gets taken out. I'm not sure why investors are called investors. Yeah. I don't know. That seems a bit strange, considering that they're sucking out. Yeah, exactly, takers rather than investors. More serious point. In terms of accountability, the kind of metrics we're talking about are sort of endpoint accountability. So you could have a starting point accountability where you have taxpayers determining what type of research we should do, right? You have panels of taxpayers sitting and saying, we're going to fund these research projects. And that's another form of accountability you can have. And so again, there could be issues with that, but that would be another kind of suggestion, I guess.
There's a question in the back, so if you can throw the box.
Too bad it's not finishing it soon. So, Keane, this is a question about entrepreneurship versus rentership, which is really intriguing. Did I sense a slight negative connotation in the list of attributes under the rentership scenario? Or are they simply two perfectly acceptable society models of, making a profit and driving the economy? So can we actually sit here and say this is good and this is bad? Because
currently, rentiers, the rentier, the notion of a rentier emerges in the 19th century as you have the emergence of public corporations, so corporations that are traded on stock markets essentially, and so you have people who live off the income, unearned income, and they're classified as rentiers. They're seen as almost seen as parasites. So it's a very negative perspective in the 19th century, and that follows into the early 20th century with people like John Maynard Keynes, who, for example, talks about the euthanasia of the rentiers, and other people talk about the same kind of thing. So it's about seeing the extraction of unearned income as being a negative quality. I think entrepreneurs and rentiers, if you look at them now, look at the concepts now, I think that I am going to try and not be as negative in my necessary, my characterization of rentership. You can be, because if we think of ourselves as being rentiers, and we essentially are, then we can't be too down on ourselves if we want to pursue that kind of concept. But you can also be critical of entrepreneurship, right? So there's another side of it as well. So in this talk, I was characterizing rentership negatively, yes. And that I hope that was obvious.
In general terms,
yeah.
Should we think about it like that, or should we just accept the blurring boundaries between the two, and
Well, I think we can do it. I think we can conceptualize them mutually, if you like, and we can think about them mutually in different ways. And so I think that rentiers in the past, rentiers have been characterized as being passive, these passive people who just sit there, getting this unearned income. But I think the way I'm thinking of rentership is that it's much more active, and a much more active kind of process that people are undertaking. So you have to actually, you can't just sit back and just let the money flow to you. You actually are involved in managing this extraction of value, or managing various arrangements, social arrangements, and manipulating, exploiting social arrangements or socioeconomic arrangements or whatever. But yeah, it was negative in this talk. Yes.
Just pass it on to the person next to you. Yeah.
This question is for Kirby. Thanks for the informative session. It was really enlightening. The question that I have is, you spoke about lignocellulosic-based biofuels. What do you think of algal biofuels? I don't know if Canadian context, I don't think it would be applicable with this weather that we have, but still.
There are a few ways you could do algal biofuels. One of them would control for those weather factors. You could produce them in tubes and those sorts of things. I think the same lens that I applied to lignocellulose could be applied to algal biofuels. These types of technologies and the fuels that we would need in order to drive a biorefinery that's based on algal biofuels would appropriate different kind of environments. And so actually one of the motivations to go toward algal biofuels is precisely because of the land use concerns that we saw associated with lignocellulose. So I'm currently working with a company that is thinking about offshore platforms, right? So that we site these things, potentially in very warm environments and seascapes that have very particular sea surface temperature, that are not exposed to hurricanes, all sorts of things, and potentially even near to existing oil platforms, right? You can see some of the allure, the potential for developing these things offshore. And the implications there, we got to think about exclusive economic zones, implications with shared conflicts over space with shipping lanes and with fisheries and those sorts of things. So I think that from a land use efficiency perspective, algal biofuels could be one among many solutions, but any new solution creates new challenges that we will need to address. And so I think that they're third generation, they're much further off, always 5 years away, so to speak.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think they could be.
The next question, the last one. What do you think is...
Questions, so please have your answers and questions briefly. I was told that academics ask long questions and there is longer answers.
No, it's a short
Again,
question.
it's all blamed on our folks in here, please.
Okay, do you think Canadian environment is favorable for biofuels in terms of policy? How are we placed vis-a-vis US or Europe?
Yeah, I think it makes it very difficult to compete with, say, Brazil. And the markets that have been created in Canada are what we would call willed markets. So the previous policy direction was to remove the excise tax on gasoline that was blended with ethanol. And that just encouraged a whole lot of Brazilian ethanol into the Canadian market because it was cheaper to produce there. And so they would blend with Brazilian ethanol. But there was a very conscious political decision to bring these industries onshore, so to speak, by re-adding that excise tax and investing the 10 cents per liter that they're now gaining in revenue gain into the development of local refineries, so that the corn market could rebound, so that rural Ontario, which was suffering from this increasing Rust Belt, could be sort of revitalized with new industry. So we're competing because of of policy-based reasons. But I think that there is great rationale to be thinking about the use of biomass in Canada for fuels and chemicals. The question is energy the best use of our biomass, and under what political economic conditions are we going to be able to utilize our own resources to produce the fuels that we, as Canadians, as North Americans, whatever the case might be, would see most appropriate.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. Keen, I was wondering if you want to perhaps introduce a distinction in terms of the notion of rentiership in its transformation historically, because it strikes me that what you're talking about, the kind of manifestations, contemporary manifestations of it, which are the kind of Martin Shkreli and the patent trolls, this is a form of predatory rentiership rather, that is a qualitative break from the way in which someone like Ricardo would understand the model. And what enables that is the fact that we have a model where it's not simply that you're squatting on something that you own and charging others who need it to use it, but that you are charging exorbitant and deliberately exorbitant rates because the market supposedly allows you to do that, and your sacrosanct right as a rentier makes it such that that's perceived as legitimate. So what you have, the absurd case of Shkreli and his company, is that you have you have him completely unapologetic about the fact that he can charge the rates that he does for this HIV/AIDS drug, you know, which is, I don't know what it was, but like 100 times more than what I believe was it roughly. 5,000, yeah, sorry, oh, there, so there, yeah. So you're making my case for me, yeah, the increase, the 5,000, yeah, so that's where you have this kind of pathology, and that's a very different model, and it's partly enabled by the fact that there's an unwillingness on the part of governments to regulate this, and in fact to prosecute that kind of predatory and arguably criminal behavior.
So, quick response, there are lots of different types of rentiership, I think, the way I see it, because there's rent, as I said at the beginning, there's an intellectual history to economic rent and rent seeking that I couldn't go into. And it's interesting because you can see lots of different types, you know, over time the concept evolves and there's lots of different types of rentiership that you can identify. And we can talk about that at some other point in the future. So I think, yeah, there is a way, you know, there is a need to distinguish between different forms of rentiership. I do think, though, that people like Ricardo, even writing in the 19th century about landowners, I still think they thought of it as being predatory and parasitic. Because the landowners were the people who were, you know, they were parasitic upon capitalists, upon the entrepreneurs, and they were extracting value from the entrepreneurs and the capitalists without doing anything productive. And that's the way that Ricardo was framing it and people at the time were framing it. So I think there are distinctions, but I think there are also similarities. But you know, I'll talk to you later. I'll talk to you at some other point about these. Yeah.
It has to be very quick. Just pass it on to your next person there, Thomas. Yeah. Yeah, I know.
So a question for you, Alison. You've given us a description of the close relationship between Thomson Reuters and other similar organizations and university administration. How about in the Canadian context, the relationship with funding agencies and the overseeing ministers and sub-ministers that make policies that are then passed down?
You mean what's the relationship between the state and corporate actors?
Yes, in the context of funding research, or how much is known. Maybe it's not even well known.
I don't know. But all I do know at the moment is that I think 8 out of the 15 research-intensive universities are licensed, or have licensed insights. So I don't know yet. I've actually talked to my own VP research about it, and they're at Western about to adopt it, but I think just for the STEM disciplines, because the arts and humanities pushed back and said this doesn't work for us. And so then now we're, you know, yet another committee to figure out how to develop metrics that will work for arts and humanities. So in terms of the way that SHRC or NSERC or CHRIR, whatever it is, view metrics, I'm not sure. I don't know. So that's the short answer.
Very good. Last question goes to Jeremy.
Well, of course, as you all know, one of the objectives of this meeting was to have different disciplines and try and get interaction. It was interesting, this last topic got us all on the same wavelength because, you know, hey, we're being evaluated regardless of our discipline. But I want to bring back to the biofuels and sort of go into interdisciplinarity again, because you're talking about land use. And of course, I work on the monarch butterfly. And most of you probably have heard it's declining, but the corridor through which it migrates up from Mexico into the United States, which is the place where the next generation builds up and goes throughout the summer, the over 200 million acres were taken out of sort of pasture lands and regular lands where there were lots of plants growing which monarchs and others could use, and were put into corn and soybeans, much of it for biofuels. And so if we're going to get back into how we use land use relative to things like biofuels, I would argue that it then has to be very disciplinary, and one doesn't have to just look at the socio-economic, the part you use the word ecology, and that will have to be taken into account, because the other thing that happened was not only were they using the land, which therefore milkweed, for example, couldn't grow, they were using transgenic plants, Roundup Ready, which you can spray. So what does it do? It kills all of the weeds. And guess what milkweed is? It's a weed. So not only we removed the land, we then also, what land was being used, it could no longer be used, and we have this. So I'm not arguing that we shouldn't do these sort of things for biofuels, but we really do need to get back to being a lot more interdisciplinary, and when we use the land, think about not only ourselves, but how it all goes back. And that sort of goes back to what Chantal and Carrie were saying. We're part of it, we're not on top of it.
No, absolutely. I think that I would completely agree with that assessment. As we think about this new pressure on land use systems, we need to be thinking about the types of environments that we find acceptable. And biofuel technologies prefer monocrops. Like, they prefer a very specific type of feedstock. That is how they are most efficient and most effective. And I think that there's increasingly now a trend to trying to move away from some of these issues by identifying what are considered wastelands in ecological terms and in socioeconomic terms. By trying to identify, I was talking with Lenore earlier, abandoned agricultural land, right? Where these fuels could be grown, and if we can overcome the yield gap, if we can, at the feedstock production side of things, if we can overcome the yield gap and the ethanol production side of things, if we can reduce consumption, if, then all we need to use are these wastelands and these marginal agricultural lands. And so part of this is thinking about actively and purposefully trying to repurpose land use systems in order to derive sustainable energy, but thinking critically about how we are asking ecosystems to do very specific things for us and not accounting for some of the broader ecosystem services that we're ultimately going to need as well, right? So I think it certainly is an ecological and also a political issue.